I teach at Doane College in Crete, Nebraska, and I'm poet in residence there. In the last, 20 years, I've gotten interested in, I've always been interested in narrative poetry, but I've gotten interested in writing it myself. And I've done quite a number of narrative poems. By narrative, I mean maybe it might even be in lyrical form, but I'm telling some kind of a story, something that has, even if it's only anecdotal, that has a beginning, a middle, and more or less an end. I love to write short poems. I'm especially fond of writing quatrains, 4-line poems. I've always liked short poems, the Greek anthology, haiku, that sort of thing. And I've always wanted to try to say as much as I could in as short a space as I could. I think probably a lot of people looking at my work over the years would say that I was a nature poet, but I think probably there's less evidence for that now. I think now I'm more likely to write about people than I was 20, 25 years ago. I think 30 years ago I was probably, could be classified as a nature poet. I'm never too sure what that means, though. If somebody writes about nature, how can we not write about nature? We are natural, and we occur in nature ourselves. We take our being from nature. So that seems to me a superfluous designation. So I don't know. I guess one of the things that and I think in common with other poets, maybe most poets, one of the things I'm always hoping to do is to write a poem that I have never written before. That is to say, different in terms of subject matter or emphasis or tone or something like that. Because one of the most boring things in the world is to read your own work consistently. That's why we read other writers, why we read other poets. And so as a poet, I'm always trying to be able to do something different, if for no other reason than to make my own work more interesting to me when I read it. So I'm continually looking for ways to write about new things, though. Subject matter. There are lots of kinds of poems that I can't write. And every poet, I think, reads other poets partly with a feeling of jealousy. You know, this poet can do this, and gee, I wish I could do that. That sort of thing. Probably that's one of the things that spurs us on to continue writing. So I guess I'm always looking for things that I might be able to write about. I cannot write a political poem. If I try to write a poem on a political theme, it comes out tremendously awkward. I feel as though I'm writing on stilts. That's just one example, and there are other things. I do very much enjoy writing about people. I enjoy telling stories about them. A lot of times I'm not making the stories up. I'm not doing an amalgam of real happening and made up things the way fiction writers often do. Sometimes though I am giving something that I've had described to me by somebody, and what I would consider to be the bare bones of a story, and then I work with that. It's very hard to characterize this, though, because I'm sure I'm not thinking of a number of things that I'm trying to do. But just in general, I think it's important for a poet or any writer to try to expand the parameters of what he or she can do. If you don't do that, you end up writing the same 3 or 4 poems, or the same 3 or 4 stories, or whatever, throughout your career. One of the ways I became aware of the poetic nature of language, or capability of language, was by reading William Faulkner when I was in high school. And one of my teachers gave me a copy of The Sound and the Fury, and I just couldn't believe that language. There was a magical quality to it. There have been so many poets, Frost and Hopkins and Dylan Thomas and Yeats, and in our own time, Eliot, of course, a lot of so-called minor poets. In any given age, the preponderance of really good poetry is written by minor poets. People like John Crow Ransom, for example, and Hart Crane. Carl Shapiro, who was my teacher at the University of Nebraska. Going back in time, well, just lots and lots of poets, from the poets of the Greek anthology right on up to the present day. No, I don't think I'm aware of an audience when I write. I think except insofar as I imagine myself talking to somebody. But I think all of us have split ourselves up into two people. As we speak to each other, we say, what did you do that for? And so that part of me will be saying something to the other part of me in that sense. I think we're not always aware of that, but that's always going on. So that one part of me is speaking to the other part of me, I suppose. But I'm not thinking of an audience, and I'm almost never thinking of what I'm writing might say to somebody else. I trust that it will have something to say to a number of people, but I'm not thinking about that. I think if I were considering that it would tend to inhibit me, I would think. So I'm concentrating so wholly on the language and the sound, what I'm I have an inkling of something, and I'm trying to get that sound, trying to fit the words to that sound. In the old days, of course, in classical Greek poetry, for example, a lot of those poems were written to be sung, and they were accompanied on the lyre. That's where we get the term lyric poetry. Sappho, for example, her work. But I don't know, I'm not a musician, I don't even read music. I've sung in choirs without ever having learned how to read music, but I just imitate the guy next to me until I know it. So I'm not a musician, but I do think there is definitely some kind of analogy there. There is some kind of reaching for a curve of sound. You're trying to follow that out. If you're lucky, you get it all the way down through the poem. And it's also an easy thing to lose. It's like staying on skis for your first downhill run, you know. It's just, staying up is really hard. And you know, for me, if I lose if I lose that sound, if I lose the following of that curve, it's very, very difficult to get it back. The opportunity for people to hear a writer reading his or her work is absolutely essential. That is the very touchstone and the very basis of the whole thing. In fact, you can't really have poetry silently. And a lot of people will read a poem, and if they think no one's around, they'll read it aloud and try to break that very strong cultural thing that we read silently. But of course, poetry especially is made to be read aloud, even to be declaimed and chanted. A great reader like Dylan Thomas in the 1950s came to the United States and just took the country by storm simply because he had such a booming voice and so much energy and enthusiasm for the work. And I think that showed that hunger is always there. And I see it all the time with my students when I read a poem or a story to them in class. This started off to be a reading of narrative poems, and there still are some narrative poems here which will attest to that original intention, but I don't know, I kept tearing apart the reading and putting it back together until last night I realized that my time for doing that was getting rather short. And so what I ended up doing was just deciding to go with, I think I've got 14 poems here, not trying to put them together by type or anything like that, but simply to go with some poems that I particularly like. In one case, I'm going to read a new poem just to kind of try it out. But the first poem which I'm going to read this evening is entitled Display. And this is a poem, as many of my poems are, of trying to capture a memory, and this goes back 30-some years to a time when my wife and our older son and I lived in the country near Austin, Texas. And this is a poem about the peacocks, which our landlady kept. We lived about 3-4 miles out in the country, and the peacocks would roost on the roof at night, and we would hear them. If you've heard peacocks, you know that sort of unearthly cry that they have. It was a long time before I got used to that, and then when we moved away from that place, I ended up missing that cry. Anyway, this is about that, and it's also about being the younger of 2 cocks with 1 hen available. So this poem is called Display. In Texas, in the country, our landlady kept peacocks, a little flock of 2 cocks and a hen. They roosted on our roof at night. We'd hear their scuttling and their eerie cries as they settled on the tiles above our heads. Beyond our bedroom's double window stood a fig tree. Among its slotted leaves the green figs fattened, and in my mind the tree and fruit became somehow associated with the peacocks. Maybe it was the leaves, their dusty iridescence. One summer morning, looking out the window, I saw the younger cock fan out his tail. All that draggled plumage suddenly up straight and shimmering with pure desire. All that gold green and blue, a shivering fire. The hen was feeding there beneath the fig, dun-colored and not interested. But the young cock kept trying, partly folding, then fanning out again his bright display as the hen went on pecking in the grass. And then, as if become embarrassed, the young cock all at once desisted. Slowly his plumage folded the shimmer in, drew lids across its eyes, and he began to feed. At least he'd satisfy this other need. That was a poem which is really a departure for me, because I was trying to write some of the lines of the poem in free verse and some of the lines of the poem in more standard metrics. I wanted to see if that would work. And I've always promised myself, since I wrote that, which was about 1.5 years ago, I promised myself to try that again, but so far I haven't done that. Several years, well, this is more than several years. When you get to be my age, 10 years is several years. Some time ago, maybe 15 years ago now, for a brief while there was a gong which was placed in the hallway at our church. And one day I was there and I was alone, and I took the opportunity to really inspect the gong, and I would do a little ping on it and hear that sound reverberate around and so forth. And so I don't know whether I did this immediately, but not very long afterwards I went home and wrote a poem about it. And I think probably not surprisingly, the thing that was suggested to me by the quiet ringing of the gong was the tide coming in and going out in the sea. So this poem is about that. It's called Gong. As though I turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when I lifted it, like the buckle in the middle of a saw blade, I stepped behind it. There at the fluted rim poised the far-running fluxions of the sea, a tide that still resounds far out of sight, in the deep race whose shudder lifts the swell, whose gray-green distant silence echoes back to that still moment when the upraised hand, as from the world's foundations, fell, and the water shattered on the grassy sand. These plastic folders always seem so handy when you decide to use them, but not so handy when you get up here at the lectern. It's another poem of memory. My mother's father and his, he and my grandmother lived on North 32nd Street in Lincoln, 32nd and Fair Street, if you know the town. And this is a memory of childhood. He was a fisherman, and he used to keep the heads of the catfish that he caught nailed to the wall of the shed. Fish heads. As high on the wall of the chicken shed as he could reach, my grandfather kept the heads of the catfish that he caught, each one impaled on a bright 10-penny nail. They would face out into the waves of heat all summer long, each fresh head wearing a wreath of wrangling flies for several days, until the skin began to shrink and crack like leather badly cured, and head by head a row of skulls appeared. When Grandpa sat on the low-slung bench along the wall and leaned forward, rubbing his hands together, and then let fly with a dark as licorice stream like a long-held oath from the plug he chewed, we knew he was about to tell a story, one that was bound to seem grotesque. For there, in the glare of white above his head, a school of weathered skulls adorned the shed. Well, this is one that I just wrote a couple of months ago. Probably shouldn't have told you that. But this is out of the same time period in my memory bank. It's called This Wind. I remember this wind from another August, tossing the leaves of the Chinese elms in the little grove on the vacant lot where we sat and played, my cousin and I, all those years ago. Not what it was we did that day, but the blistering heat of mid-afternoon and the dancing screen of wind-blown shade and the sense we had of another world, time-stopped and free and far away from the white frame house just down the alley where my cousin stayed for a week or two with my mother's folks. And from the immense dimensions of play, how we rose and turned and went back to the house through the alley gate, and then in the kitchen, how we reached for the glasses, sweaty with ice, of fresh lemonade. I could probably run a little survey here asking how many of you had done what is talked about in the next poem, and you would probably answer honestly, but except for fear of dating yourselves. This poem is called X-ray Fitting. Do you remember in Wells and Frost, the X-ray machine that you stood on? And you looked through the thing and you saw your feet floating around there and in that green light. Well, this is a poem about that. And we were purchasing Buster Browns. And I say we were purchasing, that is to say, I was in tow with my mother. She was purchasing. I was just there providing the feet upon which the shoes were slipped. X-ray fitting. I stood on the platform and slipped my feet into the wide slot that awaited them in the new Buster Browns. "Have a look, son," the salesman said. So I bent over, and there, through a rubber-bumpered viewer like the mask of a stereopticon, my feet were bathed in a green, fluid light. It was as if they floated up to me bone by separate bone, two fossil fish displayed in the stone of the tried-on shoes, and not the articulate skeletons of my two left-footed feet. Ignorant, as we all were then, of the Rankin's sleight of hand, at the salesman's kind command I wriggled my toes as with a pointer he showed my mother on the other side the growing room I had inside this pair. That was good enough for her. Wrapping up my old shoes in the new pair's box, he winked and handed me an unblown up balloon. Outside, the leather of my brand new shoes gave back the ordinary light, so bright it made me blink. Yet as we walked along, I saw in my mind's eye, as clear as day, the toes of each foot like a dorsal fin, the bones within awakened from the stone. Two fossils in green water swim away. Thank you. I was many years before I could write about my childhood. I don't know quite why that was, or maybe I, for a long time, wasn't particularly interested. I don't exactly remember. But once I got started doing it, they came in a flood for about 10 years. And I would start to chastise myself about not another poem about childhood. But there are just so many wonderful memories, and I try to resist the impulse. And I think I'm probably doing better at it now, but I've probably already mined so many of these memories that not too many more of them will occur. Well, here's something that probably many of you did. Must say about myself as a child, you take the average child's innocence and naivete and multiply it many times, and also somebody who was absolutely literal. I would take everything literally up until the time I was, I don't know when that stopped. Maybe in some ways it hasn't stopped yet. This is a poem about placing a nickel on the tracks to see what will happen as the train goes by. A test. My ear to the smooth, cold, shiny rail. I thought I heard, far off, the rumor of the approaching freight. And placing a nickel on the tracks as I'd been told to do, I hid well back in the weeds to wait. Around the bend now came the whistle. I'd heard the stories of derailments, of the hurtling tons momentum twisted in a question mark, strewing cars down the embankment in a sickening plunge, and felt a sudden stab of conscience. The whistle calling me from hiding to substitute a dime, that one less 32nd of an inch that might make all the difference, only there wasn't time. Now, under the wheels, the nickel rode in place like a coin of light at the lip of a pool, or like the ratchet of a bobbin as it twitches round the circuit of thread paid off a spool. And when the last car was safely by, I found a wafer of smooth silver awaiting me on the rail, and took it. It was still slightly hot, and rubbed it against my thumb, feeling the words for it fail. I've often wished that I could remember his last name, and I don't, but when I was a kid on South 22nd Street in Lincoln, there was a man who came by, I think, 3 times a week with a produce wagon, a horse-drawn wagon, and I can remember my mother purchasing fruit and vegetables and lettuce and so forth. So this is a memory of this experience. You might notice that I'm a minimalist when it comes to titling. And I write about a produce wagon, and so this poem's called Produce Wagon. I think it was seeing the heat shimmer along a street one summer day that brought this memory back to me. Produce Wagon. The heat shimmer along our street one midsummer mid-afternoon, and wading up through it a horse's hooves, and each shoe raising a tongueless bell that tolled in the neighborhood, till the driver drew in the reins and the horse hung its head and stood. and something in a basket thin as shavings. Blackberries? Or a ghost of the memory of having tasted them? Passing into my hands as mother paid, and the man got up again, slapping the loop from the reins, and was off on his trundling wagon. This next poem is a is a sonnet, which I've been writing increasingly in recent years, kind of returning to the so-called forms a little bit. And this is a poem about the thing that I remember mainly from childhood, which was anticipating things, and things were going to be wonderful, and sort of hanging out anticipating. And things most often were disappointing and didn't come up to the mark, or else they didn't happen. I remember Friday night. Friday night was the anticipator's mecca, because you had, as a grade school child, you had your whole weekend ahead of you, which just went by quickly, and you didn't do anything, and you were, suddenly it was Monday morning and you were going back to school. So this little vignette that is embodied in this particular sonnet really, I think, embodies my view of what my childhood was like more than anything else. It was hanging out and expecting things to happen. Anticipation. That Christmas that I wished, along with snow, for my own sled, to make a run downhill with all the eyes around me there in tow, and reach without an overturn or spill the bottom of the slope, and in the chill of that bright, festive, breath-filled winter air, haul by its rope the sled back up the hill to the acclaim of cheering strangers there. I'd been so reckless and so debonair. I got the sled, but no snow followed it. Against the basement wall I propped it, where the furnace flame reflected, hollowed it, made in the varnish a bright melting pool, my proper mirror, who looked and saw a fool. Now that's probably a little hard on me as a child. I think that's myself as a middle-aged person. My mother and sister for some years have lived in Las Vegas, and on various trips to Las Vegas, one of the things we usually do on separate afternoons is go to two places which are very close to Las Vegas. And I'm not really very much of a fan of Las Vegas itself and of all of the glitter and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, I get the aesthetic heebie-jeebies, I think, just going up and down the streets. And so it's really kind of necessary for some R&R to get away from that. There are two wonderful places within a stone's throw, 5 and 15 miles of Vegas. And one is called Red Rock Canyon, and the other is called Mount Charleston, excuse me. And so this poem really is two short poems taken together, one about each of these places. And you might, I'll just tell you this because your ear will follow it more easily, I think, if I do tell you. Part of the fun and the challenge for me in writing the poem, once I got down a little ways into it and could see that this was a possibility, the first stanza is 4 lines, and the second stanza reduces then to 3. And when I got down to the third stanza, I said, well, I'll just make this 2. And then I think I'll then invert it and turn it around so it comes back out with 3 and 4. Just a little game I was playing. I don't know that it affects the poem. But it affects the way it sounds to a certain extent. West of Vegas, 1. Red Rock Canyon. Sagebrush and Joshua establish the range of green. The sky counsels lightly and moves on. Like a cloud over a peak, light glints from a rock and is gone. Everything rides on a glance as quick as a tongue. The hike to the springs, the blacktop spur to Lost Creek Canyon, the savor of water in every place name. Oh, kneel and drink in the desolation. 2. Mount Charleston. There, in the break ahead, snow mist over the valley. Suddenly desert scrub is pine and cedar. The gray stone bed of Deer Creek scrabbles down from a source in the clouds. It goes to your head, this lighter air, this tick of flurries. The pull of the grade whines in the engine. Cliffs tower above pines. The air outside is wet and gray. A few large flakes swirl lazily as we enter the lodge. Okay. Thought I'd read a few poems tonight from my collection, Pointing Out the Sky. In a way, these poems have a good deal in common because both of them were written when I was away from home on retreat, as it were. The first of these is called Recreation rather than Recreation. And the second one is based on a story that a friend told me about his walk around a monastery farm. I never took the walk myself, so this is just based on what the friend told me. First of these, Recreation. This is the morning that never was before, that listens to the robin listening for the worm, the cedar choral of the mourning doves, that takes the path laid down by the slug beneath the strawberry leaves, a quickening track like mercury over the dew-fall grass. This is the day the washing hangs so full of light and snowy folds, it makes one rippling garment, a robe tried on by the breeze. This is the way we take ourselves on waking into what we are, the high blue sky without a cloud, whatever it is that calls to us out of our own astonishment. This is the morning. A walk round the monastery farm. Gravel and bits of sand in the ruts of the farm road, every step leaving its little wake of dust, and the bushes and trees drenched with a shower of birdsong, the unseen glittering eyes like ripening berries. Last night over tea in the refectory, the talk contended like the coils of steam above each glazed white faded china cup, pure excitement gleaming at the lip. Today, this confrontation with the world, oneself alone, oneself against the din of every single blessed thing alive, rending the silence like the temple curtain. And still the little cloud of dust behind you dogging your steps, yet showing you the way. The road leads up out of the hollow past an old wagon standing in a field, its hubs grown rusty as the heads of Milo, the spokewood weathered into cracks and seams. Up ahead, 3 pines against the sky, shimmer in the heat as in a dream. The next 3 poems, actually the last 3 poems I'm going to read, do have a common center. They all are things that happened to a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine named Adam Stive, or to somebody in his family. And the first of these poems is about his mother, and this more or less replicates the last several weeks of her life, when she was thinking primarily about her girlhood on the farm where she'd grown up in North Dakota. And the kerosene lantern was so important in that particular situation that she was worried that they were going to run out of kerosene. So one of her last concerns was she kept making her son go out to the garage to make sure there was still some kerosene left. And he went out and he verified that for her. And as soon as she was, you know, at ease in that regard, I think she died like a day later, something like that. But it took him some time to figure out that she was actually asking him to go and do that. He just thought she was kind of raving. The second poem then, which I'm going to read, is about this same person's father. The poem is called Certificate. Some years ago, did it again, we went up to my friend's restaurant in Norfolk, Nebraska, and he took one of these mailing tubes and unfolded this beautiful certificate. It must have been about this size. And it came from the old country. His father came from German-Russian stock, and he had come over from the Ukraine. And this was a combination birth certificate, baptism certificate, and confirmation certificate. And it was wonderful. It had wonderful paintings all around the border. It was a work of art, and he's now got that framed. It's just a gorgeous thing. Anyway, this explains a little bit about my friend's father, whose name was Edward Steib, and he's mentioned in the poem. And then the final poem, which I'm going to read, Keeping the Horses, while it does not follow exactly what happened to my friend, it follows the rough outline of what happened. So my friend really figures in all three of these poems, directly or indirectly. Kerosene. As a girl on the farm in North Dakota, she'd fill the lamp, trim the wick and light it and set it on the kitchen table. And something pleased her about its light, the small companionable hiss it made in burning, and the stable well of the thick glass base around the fuel. Once she ironed far into the night, something for all 10 strapping brothers, her shadow watching that she did it right. There at the end, that shadow towered like a trick of light. She worried about the kerosene. Would he mind going out to the garage to see there was some left, the son she turned to with the burning look of a last concern? He went and looked, and yes, there was some left. She thanked him, then turned over on her side and slept the first sound sleep she'd slept for months. In her dream, someone went from room to room in darkness, the well of the lamp run dry. She was a wonderful woman. I met her, was around her 5, 6, 8 times when I was up at my friend's house. And she was always so concerned that you weren't going to eat enough. And I mean, she was constantly at me to have some more. This would go on for hours, seemed like days, but she was really sweet. The poem now about the certificate. The thick, cream-colored paper, stiff with age, is conjured from its uncapped mailing tube. My friend unrolls it on the tablecloth like a disused drumhead. One curling end keeps scrolling up on him until we help. We anchor its 4 corners with the salt and pepper and with a pair of ashtrays, and then lean over, our pointing fingers ready. A relic of his father's past, its official paper, attesting trove. Witness, like the Godhead, 3 in 1, to a birth, baptism, and confirmation. Geboren 1898 in some far Ukrainian hamlet that to us, in its straight up and down old German script, now reads as anywhere you damn well please. His father's people, having been among the second wave of Germans settled there after the lead of Catherine the Great a century before, whose policies still drew and prospered them. And then confirmed, according to this, in 1913, the young man who would read theology, which in this country he would put to use, a fierce agnostic, to refute the claims of all believers, and especially the Armageddon crowd who had the world's end worked out to the millisecond, who fondly quoted St. Luke's caveat, "For the Son of Man cometh at an hour when ye think not," like the very devil quoting Scripture to his devious ends. But that would all come later, with the years of showing horses at the county fairs, at the fallen, bitter end of his career. Here on this paper now he is 15 and foreign Ukrainian, yet to leave his family and their calculations for him, the cold love that trained him for a pastor and consigned him to bringing in the sheaves, to take his passage for America and be the son that every family grieves. We hover thus over his story here, or its beginnings. The certificate takes all our breath away, its borders dressed with tabs like an entablature of stone, making the document look almost like an altar front or window of stained glass. There are panels bearing Bible quotes, and the gold leaf backgrounds of medallions framing the icons of their images, grape leaf and cluster, chalice, lamb, and crown, and swags of grapevine, leaf, and tendril worked round and in among familiar scenes from Christ's own ministry. Incredible the soft, white, chalky blues, the iodine of sash and snow white of a sleeve, the whole strict harmony of gesture here and background, and with what certainty the Edward Stibe, mentioned but once here, but that once for good, turned from all the certainties around him. Most often I make the poem come and get me. I'm a little bit lazy in that regard, and so I just, for instance, I might have a line going in my head, and I will sort of keep saying that so I don't lose it, but I'll just kind of wait. It's a kind of an expectant feeling, and then if I'm lucky, maybe an hour later, 2 hours later, that line will spill over and some other things will start happening. Maybe by the time I've got 4, 5, 6 lines going in my head, and I can see it's going to be a longer poem, then I'll go get a notebook or get on the computer. It doesn't really make any difference to me which method I choose for writing it down, although I do feel that if I write it out by hand, I feel somehow more closely involved physically. I'm not sure if that makes the poems better or not. And so I suppose most typically that's what I do, is I somewhat resist the poem for a little bit. If I can see it's going to be a really short poem, I will try to get the whole thing worked out in my head before I go to write it down. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes I lose them, or I lose interest. I kind of try to make the poem come to get me, to fetch me a little bit. You know, if I'm going to put in this work, you show me your credentials. You make sure. I want to make sure that you really want to happen. So when I have creative writing classes, I approach that a little differently, and I usually give them some kind of an exercise, or we talk about some poem or story or something pretty closely, and examine, you know, what makes it work. When I'm teaching my essay classes, that's a little bit different because mostly I'm giving the students, well, I'm trying to get them to avoid making so many mistakes. I'm trying to get them to understand that their writing is a performance and that they need, when, you know, if they keep falling off the wire, you know, their writing is not going to succeed. So they're out there with the pole and they're, you know, and I say, proofread, and all this kind of thing. And I think they think I'm pretty tough. I get on their cases, but I kid around a lot. I think that people really are liberated tremendously when they write. And the trouble is that a lot of kids get wounded coming through junior high and high school. They get somebody who tells them that they cannot write, and then they start believing that. And then, you know, when you get them in college, you've got to show them that that's not true, and why it's important to them to learn how to write well, because if they don't, it will handicap them in the job place. I think partly it has to do with the weather, with the sky out here. Carl Shapiro's famous phrase, Nebraska, where the sky settles all questions. You're confronted by this nonstop sky. You have to go away somewhere to appreciate that and to realize how important that is to you. When we lived in Germany for a year and a half in the mid-1970s, I could see quite a bit of the sky, but it was mostly cloudy. It rained every day. I wasn't used to that. And I missed the open sky. I missed the splendiferous sunsets. I missed all that kind of stuff. Even just when you go back east to New Jersey or somewhere where the trees are growing up right to the side of the road and you only see avenues of sky rather than the whole sky. I think maybe it has something to do with that. There's a clarity to the weather out here. There's a clarity to the visual perspective that may attract poets. There are plenty of fiction writers, of course, as well. But, and I think possibly the struggle to define this place or to try to come to terms with it as a writer, I think this is a harder milieu for the writer to deal with than a number of other places in the United States in terms of landscape and so forth. And also out here, if you're writing poetry, you're continually battling stereotypes. Everybody else in the country thinks that Nebraska is flat from end to end, whereas 95% of the state is rolling hills. I don't know how to account for the fact that there are so many poets. Dana Gioia, the well-known critic and poet, when he was here in connection with the Weldon Keys Festival in 1988, said that he thought Nebraska probably had more good poets per capita than any other state in the Union. And I don't know how to account for that, but there are a lot of good poets here. Keeping the horses. The boy had been alone for 15 days before the thought occurred to him. This time, maybe the old man wasn't coming back at all. It was just him and the horses, feeding their way around the tether stakes in a good bit of meadow by the road, the boy sleeping out with them at night upon the ground, the nights not yet grown cold. By daylight, watching over them until he half suspected when he talked to them they were about to answer, those great eyes, the telltale shivers in the flank and haunch. Even the horses had been feeling it, the small uneasiness that moved inside him. He brushed them down, went to fetch water up from the creek 100 yards away. Hauling it back, he heard the waters sway and lap against the bucket at his side. A car went by from the farm down the road. He waved, and the driver waved, and the dust swept out and made a tunnel in the air, a tunnel that would suddenly collapse. And he thought of his mother through the years, trying to glimpse like that his father's quick, authoritative passage through their lives. He would be drinking now, talking about his plans with someone he hardly knew in some dark bar. The truck and van parked outside, The dust of this same road on top of other dust from all the roads they'd driven down that year, following the circuit of the county fairs with a ramshackle carnival, the horses sometimes performing in a lot out back, and sometimes to a grandstand audience. Near towns down those back roads, more and more of late, they'd pull off onto the grassy shoulder by a gate that led into a pasture, backing the animals down the splintered ramp, his father fashioning a long rope halter to lead one horse around with at a time and give the local kids a ride. It cost 2 bits some days, on other days a dime, the difference being what the old man lacked by way of change to jangle in his jeans. It always went for drink, always for that. There was never any money for the boy. The old man never thought that anyone had needs except himself. And they were poor, God, but they were poor. Many a time they'd lifted out the seat up in the cab just to scrounge around for coins. In fun they called it going to the bank. He thought of the old man, frantic for money now, lying across the pitted running board, his long legs out at angles in the street like toppled stilts beside the worn-out seat, hoping to pick up on the littered floor a beer or two in change. The sun had dipped into the lower branches of the cottonwoods down by the creek. Every day now that moment came a little sooner, and the boy saw how the grass went deep and almost wet with light at that lower angle. He walked back down toward the stand of trees for some kindling wood. One thing that you could say for the old man, there was always plenty of food in cans for cooking over a fire. As for talk, they'd never come close to running out of that. Still, with him gone, he didn't miss the talk. It was good to have the outdoors to himself, for the feeling of that, the horses there stirring and nickering, snuffling in the dark beyond the fire, the stars darting their glints far back down to him from a wet black sky. The first few days it seemed to him as if the old man were still around, but lately he'd noticed he'd begun to let things go, begun to grow wild along with the horses. There were times he wished he could run like them, the ground reverberating under him, nothing between him and the open sky, but his shadow floating out over the grass. He rummaged in the canvas knapsack bottom for the opener. For supper he'd have beans, cooked in a shallow pan until the bubbles snapped in the juice like lava on the run. Nothing better, sopped with a hunk of bread. He thought he'd move the tether stakes tonight. Then maybe afterwards he'd leave the fire and walk down by the bridge to listen to the water gurgling in its glimmering banks. One of these nights, the old man would be back, and more his thoughts were fixed on that. For several days he'd had a kind of dream shaping inside his head, a dream in which he saw himself eyeing his father there at the firelight's edge, the boy angry at being left alone to watch the horses and running against the old man with his fists. It was a dream he willed and yet could not control. Always his father in the dream would catch his wrists and wrap him in his arms, and the boy, sobbing, had to catch his breath. It was only a dream, no use to him. He knew tomorrow, next day, sometime soon, he'd hear the truck come rattling up the road, just in time for supper, probably. The old man getting out and glad to see him, wiping his mouth on the back of his hand in that absent-minded gesture of his, as casual as if he had been gone an hour or two at most. And then he'd say, "How's my boy?" and ask about the horses. Thank you.